They were sucked into a narrow oil pipeline and pulled to the bottom of the ocean. With just a few inches of air left to breathe inside of the pipeline, they were trapped for days, and a GoPro camera worn by one of the divers recorded the entire thing. This is the terrifying story of the Paria Diving Disaster, a tale about a normal workday that turned into an unbelievable nightmare. The GoPro recording of the incident is distressing, and at the end of the story, it gets even worse, so viewer discretion is advised. On February 25th, 2022, it all started out when this team of 5 professional divers were assigned to fix an undersea oil pipeline owned by Paria Fuel, a government oil company in Trinidad and Tobago. Being a commercial diver can be a dangerous job, but on this day, nobody was too worried because the repair was supposed to be easy and everyone involved had years and years of experience. And so, with that in mind, the 5 men suited up in their diving gear, snapped this photo, and confidently jumped straight into the water. Nobody knew that this would be the last photo ever taken with all of them still alive. The divers swam from their boat over to the oil pipeline, and for this job, they would be using a special habitat. Basically, they placed this big metal room over the pipe, pumped it full of air, and then the divers went inside that room and performed their work without having to use their oxygen tanks. In the GoPro video, you can see one of the divers going under the water and then resurfacing inside the habitat, where one of his friends is working. For the first few hours, everything was going according to plan and everyone was doing their assigned tasks. But very suddenly, something went horribly wrong. And take a look at this diagram to see what happened. The divers were working in the habitat here, at berth 6, where the pipeline comes to the surface of the water so that the ships can unload all of their oil. The rest of the pipe is shaped like a massive U, so it runs along the seafloor and then resurfaces at berth 5 right near the refinery. This was all common knowledge to the divers, but what they didn't know is that most of the oil had been recently sucked out of the pipe, and this made it hazardous and extremely low pressure. Because their habitat was pumped full of high-pressure air, there was a huge pressure differential, and the only thing separating the habitat from the pipeline was this large inflatable plug that was wedged in the top of the pipe. The divers needed to remove this plug to do their work, and as soon as the plug was removed, everything rushed from the high-pressure habitat into the low-pressure pipeline. An extremely powerful vortex of water sucked all of the air, all of the divers, and all of their equipment into the pipe at unbelievable speeds. As you can see in the GoPro video, it happened so fast that it was almost like somebody flipped a light switch. Inside the pipe, it was pitch black. They were completely submerged in a mix of water and crude oil, and the divers were violently colliding with the sides of the narrow 30-inch pipe as they traveled downward. Nobody had any oxygen tanks, and they couldn't see, hear, or breathe. The only thing they could do is cover their heads in the fetal position, pray, and wait. As they continued to get sucked along with the water, their skin started burning from the toxic oil sludge, and they couldn't hold their breaths much longer. Each diver concluded that drowning was probably inevitable, and there was nothing that they could do about it. But suddenly, everything stopped. The water and the crude oil slowed down and was no longer sucking them forward, and by some miracle, the divers found themselves inside of an air pocket at a slightly raised area of the pipeline. They gasped for air and inhaled for the first time since getting sucked under. The men shout out to each other in relief. They can't believe that they're alive, and when they hear the familiar voices of their friends, they are overjoyed that everyone is still alive. These men were far more than just work colleagues. They had known each other for years and worked together on countless projects, so they were all good friends and they were so glad that everyone had made it. They were also lucky to find a couple oxygen tanks that had been sucked with them into the pipe, so they quickly started taking turns breathing in the fresh air. But pretty quickly, their lungs started burning, because the toxic fumes from the crude oil in the air pocket made it incredibly unhealthy and difficult to breathe. The following is Chris, explaining the experience of being inside the pipe.
Inside it was like an unbelievable nightmare. Your eyes burning. Every time you try to open your eyes, it's burning. You're pitch black, you can't see nothing. your throat burning, your ears ringing, your body sore. And at that point, I tell myself I was going to dead.
The divers could barely keep their heads above water, and as the shock wore off, each diver also started to feel excruciating pain. They realized that they had all broken bones, had severe burns from the oil, and all sorts of cuts and scrapes from flying down that pipe at the speed of a race car. I am not a particularly claustrophobic person, but being trapped in this tiny little pipe up to my eyeballs in water sounds like just about the worst nightmare a human could possibly experience. The graphic you're seeing on screen here is proportionally accurate. The pipeline was only 30 inches wide, and they literally had to lie on their backs and press their noses into the top of the pipeline just to breathe. Chris, who began acting as the leader of the group, called out to his friends. In the midst of all this danger and chaos, his first instinct was to calm everyone else down and reassure them that everything was going to be fine. Things were looking pretty bleak, but he reasoned, if you're not dead, then you're alive. And if you're alive, you have a chance to survive. The GoPro footage is completely black during this part because there is literally no light inside of the pipeline, but we can hear Chris individually calling out to each of his friends to assess each of their conditions.
Fine. Anything happened to you?
Yusuf, anything happened to you?
Yeah, boy.
What happened?
After that was done, Chris knew that they had to get out of the pipeline as soon as possible. It was difficult to breathe, and with each minute that they stayed in there, they were inhaling more toxic fumes and exposing their skin and eyes to extreme damage from the oil. The other divers agreed that it was time to move, but first, there was a problem. They weren't really even sure which direction they needed to go. On one end of the pipeline, there was the habitat, the place where they got sucked in. But on the other side, the pipe was completely sealed and it would not allow them to escape. Chris felt that they got sucked in headfirst, and thus they needed to go this way in order to escape. But all of his friends actually disagreed, and they said that the way out was in the opposite direction. For Chris, this was rough, because he felt certain that he was right, but after hearing from his teammates, he decided to trust them. And thus, after making the decision, they began moving with the following strategy to begin their escape. The divers formed a big human chain, where each one locked onto the shoulders of the diver behind them. This was helpful because the pipe was extremely slippery with all the oil, so moving was a lot easier when they worked together and also got pushed by Faisal, who was the large and strong man at the very back of the group. Thanks to their combined strength, they slowly and painfully moved forward in the darkness. The conditions were treacherous, but the men reassured each other that each inch was getting them closer to the habitat and closer to rescue. Someone found a light and turned it on, but they still couldn't really see anything because the oil was burning their eyes and causing temporary blindness. Thinking back to the moment of the accident, the divers knew that other employees were watching them, and also there was a live video feed inside the habitat. This meant that someone definitely knew they were missing, and it made the divers feel confident that a rescue attempt from the Paria company would be underway. As they continued moving, they kept listening for signs of such a rescue. The clang of an oxygen tank hitting against the pipe, or perhaps a splash of water up ahead. But they soon encountered another problem. As time went on and they moved along the pipe, the water level was rising. The pipe was at a very slight angle, so the further they went, the less room they had to breathe. This whole time, they were already pressing their noses against the top of the pipeline in order to get air, but it was only getting worse and worse as they went on. After like an hour of this painful and claustrophobic nightmare, they reached a point where the pipeline was 100% full of water, meaning that they would have to completely submerge themselves in order to go any further. Since there were only 2 oxygen tanks, it would not be safe for all 5 men to go completely under the water. And thus, Chris went ahead to scout by himself in search of the next air pocket. He swam forward and 1 minute passed. Then 2, then 3. His heart sank. He realized his friends would not be able to continue any further. This was a very long part of the pipe that was completely underwater without any air pockets, so there was simply no way that the other divers could go forward without an oxygen tank. He returned to the group and told them that he had to go forward alone and search for rescue. His friends begged him to stay and keep the team together, and Kazim Ali Jr. even grabbed a hold of his leg. But Chris knew that they couldn't stay there doing nothing, so he kicked Kazim to free his leg. This was the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life. Kazim and the other men were his best friends, his brothers as he called them, and he had to literally kick one of them and leave them all behind. The pipe was narrow enough that Chris actually couldn't wear the oxygen tank on his back like you normally would, so he had to kind of push it in front of him while still breathing from the mouthpiece. This was awkward and made his movement somewhat slow, but he was still making good progress. He continued for quite a while, but then he had a horrifying realization. He had no idea how much oxygen was left in the tank, and he had no way to check given the complete darkness. As time went on, Chris could tell that the oxygen was running out because it was getting harder and harder to draw the air from the regulator. All he could do was continue moving, clawing at the sides of the pipe to propel himself forward. And then, it happened. The tank became completely empty, and Chris sucked out every last bit of oxygen, inhaling as hard as he possibly could. Now, he was just holding his breath. He thought, this is it. This is how I'm going to die. His lungs were bursting, his heart racing, his body begging for air. His oxygen tank collides with a second tank in front of him. He reaches out, frantically grabbing a hold of it, and he struggles to find the mouthpiece. But even when he does, it is full of oil. He has to deliberately suck out mouthfuls of sludge in order to purge it, but eventually, at the last second before drowning, he finally gets air. Chris is saved. He breathes in oxygen for the first time in several minutes, unable to believe what has just happened. He feels like the luckiest man alive, but he doesn't have time to celebrate. He still doesn't know how far he has to go or how much oxygen is inside of his new tank. Chris pushed forward with a new sense of determination. In addition to just wanting to survive and get out of there, he felt a responsibility to his friends that he had left behind. Above all, he wanted to work together with everyone on the surface to launch a rescue operation. After a while longer, Chris resurfaced in a new air pocket within the pipeline. This pocket was much smaller than the first, with less air and much less space to breathe. Regardless though, Chris was grateful for it because it meant that he wasn't in immediate danger of drowning if his oxygen tank ran out. He made it to the other end of the air pocket, where the pipe was full of water again, and then he had to face another scary decision. Should he submerge himself for a second time and potentially run out of oxygen, or wait in the current air pocket for rescue? He heard Faisal making some noise in the distance, and it seems that he had actually managed to follow him into the current air pocket. He yelled out for Chris to wait up, but Chris felt that he had to act, and he had to go get help, so he submerged himself once more. As he moved forward, his oxygen tank wasn't showing any signs of running out this time, but as fate would have it, he actually encountered a third tank somewhere in the water. He swapped it out with his current one, buying himself some more air and some more time. He kept going for a little while longer, and then his tank crashed into the wall of the pipe. This meant that he was now at the bend of the pipe where it headed back up to the surface, and he had almost made it to the end. But even at this point, Chris wasn't sure that he had gone in the correct direction to begin with. He had trusted his friends who said that this was the right way, but internally, throughout the whole thing, he thought that they could be wrong. If he had traveled hundreds of feet in the wrong direction and was now at berth 5 where the pipe was sealed off, he knew that he certainly wouldn't make it, so this was the moment of truth. As he started going upward, he tried to calm himself. He mentally prepared for a 50-50 chance at death, and he hoped for the best. He surfaces. Chris has reached the air near the top of the pipe. He tries to look upward to check if he has reached the habitat, but he can barely see because his eyes are burning and nearly blind from all the oil. He squints and tries to clear his eyes, and then he literally sees the light at the end of the tunnel, and relief washes over him as he realizes that he has gone the right way. Fortunately though, Chris still can't get himself out of the pipe at berth 6. The water level is maybe 5 or 10 feet from where the pipe is connected to the habitat, and he doesn't have the strength to lift himself out. This is crazy, he thought. He had made it all this way, almost died like 3 times, and now he was literal feet from the surface, and he was stuck, with nobody there to rescue him. He cried out to anyone listening, but there was no response. He banged a chain against the pipeline to make some noise, but nobody came. Chris remained stuck like this for 40 to 60 minutes, and then finally, he saw a familiar face. His lifelong friend and neighbor had entered the habitat to save him. At first, though, Chris didn't even recognize him because he was so delirious and partially blinded from the oil. He was lifted from the pipe and brought back to the surface, and he was still completely covered in all of this oil, but Chris only had one thing on his mind. His friends had saved him by telling him which direction to go, and now it was his turn to save them. No matter what anyone said to him, Chris would not shut up about his friends. He told everyone who would listen that Faisal was not far behind and that all 4 men were still alive inside of the pipe. He told them about the air pockets. He told them about the oxygen tanks. He told them about everything. Chris was overjoyed to be alive and finally out of the pipeline, but he was shocked to find out that so far, nobody had even tried to launch a rescue. At this point, they had been stuck inside of the pipeline for like 3 hours, and according to Chris, this type of rescue isn't too difficult if you have the right equipment and the right skills. He was actually so outraged by the lack of rescue attempts that he even tried to jump back into the water to perform the rescue all by himself. Even after escaping this waking nightmare, he still wanted to go right back in to save his friends. Since it was clear that he needed medical attention though, he was forced to go into a nearby ambulance and go to the hospital. As he was leaving the scene, he was glad to see that everyone at Berth 6 was now beginning rescue operations, and people started hustling around and making plans to commence diving immediately. Certified divers began showing up, and they were making calls to bring commercial diving gear to the scene. Once he made it to the hospital, Chris was reunited with his wife, and once that happened, he was able to relax and the adrenaline began to wear off. Since he told everyone at Berth 6 that his friends were still alive, rescue operations were obviously starting immediately, and therefore Chris was feeling very hopeful for his teammates. Sure, they were pretty banged up, but he knew that they had plenty of air left to breathe, and that rescue divers could go down exactly the same way that he had just escaped. This brought him some comfort, and finally, he was able to rest. Back inside of the pipe, the other divers had just gained a reason to be hopeful. After banging for hours, they had now received a response. People on the outside of the pipe were also tapping on it, and they started communicating back and forth. The people on the outside would tap out a certain pattern, and then the divers on the inside would respond with that same pattern, confirming that they were indeed alive and hearing the message. In that moment, the men must have felt overwhelming relief. Finally, they had proof that someone on the outside knew about them. Even after that communication stopped going back and forth, the divers inside kept banging. They constantly looked around for signs that someone was coming down the pipe, perhaps bringing oxygen tanks and a rope that could pull everyone out of there. They were always hopeful, always looking for rescue. But rescue was not coming. Not after 5 minutes, not after 24 hours, not ever. The fuel company never even tried. Despite knowing exactly where the trapped divers were, despite knowing they were still alive and waiting, Paria Fuel did not attempt a single rescue. The men suffered in there for hours, days even, and their tapping could be heard at Berth 5 long into the night. Nobody can be certain exactly how long each diver survived, but during the formal inquiry, they suggested that some divers may have been alive for up to 72 excruciating hours. Autopsies later confirmed that some of them lived until at least the 3rd day. Imagine being down there, watching the hours go by, and slowly realizing that the company you work for is deliberately choosing to let you die. The sense of betrayal was probably heartbreaking. Remember, when Chris first exited the pipe, he had found some colleagues who were eager to attempt a rescue. Family members of the trapped divers had started to show up and gather in a nearby parking lot. Several of these family members were actually experienced divers, including Kazim Ali Sr., who is obviously the father of Kaz Jr. All of these experienced divers were suiting up and they were prepared to go in and rescue their loved ones. But shockingly, Paria representatives literally blocked them from entering the pipe. At this point, everyone on the scene was collectively losing their minds. Paria was simultaneously refusing to rescue the men while also preventing everyone else from doing it too. The company simply said that rescue was too dangerous. They said that it wasn't covered by their insurance, so they couldn't allow it. Cutting the pipeline was also considered too risky. Since Paria was obviously not working on a rescue, you might be wondering what the company was doing instead. Well, as it turns out, the leader of the emergency response team was having a meeting about resuming business operations in nearby waters. This dude was literally saying things like, "How can we resume our oil shipments?" instead of, "How can we save the men dying in our pipeline?" Based on all of this, the formal inquiry later suggested that Paria officials were more concerned about the company's liability than they were about human life. And indeed, it appears that they were only thinking about money. According to one of the lawyers on the case, Paria probably realized that letting them die would be cheaper than paying their hospital bills. And so, that's exactly what they decided to do. I was shocked when I first learned this, but Paria didn't just block the rescue attempts all by themselves. They called in the Coast Guard and ordered them to lock down the entire area. Initially, everyone was thinking that the Coast Guard would help with the rescue, but no, they just stood there with their automatic weapons and guarded the entrance. After about 48 hours, Paria decided to also physically close off the pipeline, sealing the fate of anyone who was still inside. The inquiry suggested that some of the men may have still been alive at the time that the pipe was sealed. So it's very possible that when Paria sealed the pipe, someone inside heard it happening. Unfortunately, the divers' families were not treated with any respect whatsoever. It was pouring rain, and they just had to stand there in a parking lot for 3 days. They were provided with no food, no water, no shelter, no facilities, and no lights. The inquiry found that the treatment of the families was, quote, insensitive and uncivilized. For example, in an act that I can only describe as cruel, Paria prevented outsiders from bringing basic supplies to the families in the parking lot. At one point, they also had a meeting with the families to give an update, since they were all begging for answers. One woman, barely holding it together, asked the question on everyone's minds. What are you doing to rescue them? Paria's general manager, Mushtaq Muhammad, looked at her and laughed. He laughed. With men dying in the pipeline and their families sobbing just feet away, he responded with a chuckle. Overall, his cruel response pretty much sums up Paria's treatment of the families. They created a WhatsApp group and promised everyone an update within the hour, but that update never came. After that, the families didn't hear another word from Paria until they eventually told them that everyone was dead. 4 days after the men were sucked into the pipeline, Paria began a flushing operation that was aimed to recover the bodies from inside. At this point, there wasn't confirmation about whether the men were dead or alive, but one thing was clear. Nobody was going to survive being flushed out of the pipe in this way. As they pumped high-pressure water into the line, the men's bodies slowly came out the other side. Reports from people on the scene said that the bodies were in very rough shape. It was so graphic that Paria took away everyone's phones so that they couldn't record the horrors that they were seeing. Once again, the company was more focused on liability than humanity. Keeping with their trend of disrespecting the families, Paria didn't even bother to inform them that the bodies had been recovered. They had to learn at the same time as everyone else when the company made an announcement on national television. Everyone was heartbroken and extremely angry at the company. When the bodies were finally revealed, they were actually so mangled and covered in oil that they weren't even recognized by their own family members. In the end, they could only tell who they were based on tattoos. Sadly, while Chris was recovering in the hospital, he was not kept up to date about the situation. He didn't have his phone with him, and since he was there for several days, he assumed that his friends had been rescued. When he finally got his phone back and learned of the news, he was obviously devastated. He would later go on to testify about every single detail of the experience inside the pipe, and he could barely keep it together.
I feel like everything inside me hoping a rescue was going on. Nobody was making an attempt to rescue me. I felt like nobody cared for me or my diving buddies.
Even though he objectively did everything right and did everything he could to rescue his friends, he still felt that he had let them down. Not a day goes by where Chris doesn't think about his 4 friends. Years after the event, he still can't sleep because every night he relives the entire thing. His daughter often begs him to go to the beach, but every time he sees berth 5 and 6, he suffers flashbacks and can't get anywhere near the water. Because he will probably never go into the ocean again, he obviously is unable to continue working as a diver, and his family has fallen into, quote, immense financial hardship. Despite doing over $14 billion in revenue that year, Paria Fuel refused to help any of the families that they had destroyed. Eventually, in 2025, the company would pay out 1 million Trinidad and Tobago dollars, or roughly 150,000 US dollars, to each of the victims' families. However, they did this without admitting guilt, and the money is obviously far too little and far too late. Many people also suspect that the payments were political and only made because they were trying to buy the election. Paria is a government-owned country, and the payment was made just weeks before their general election. Sadly, even after receiving the payment, the families are still struggling financially without the income from each of the divers. Understandably, they are still very angry, and even today, years after the disaster, the public outcry is overwhelming in Trinidad and Tobago. Posters cover the streets with words such as, "We can't breathe," and "We want justice now." Something that still bothers me is that if Chris hadn't survived to tell this tale, it is possible that the government might have just covered up the entire thing. Chris recently revealed that he barely survived a massive fire that happened just months before the diving disaster. In his words, Paria and the government just swept it all under the rug. Nobody has ever heard of that explosive fire at berth 3, and due to the terrible safety standards, there have probably been countless other disasters that never made headlines. Overall, there are thousands of pages of documents, endless hours of testimony, and hundreds of different articles that I reviewed about this disaster. But in the end, the Commission of Inquiry provides the clearest and cleanest picture about what happened. The commission ruled that Paria's actions were grossly negligent, consequently criminal, and it recommended that they be charged with corporate manslaughter. No matter how you look at it, Paria made little or no attempt to rescue anyone, and they deliberately left those men in the pipeline to die.
I'm 35 too. I'm trying to come up. Get around. Yeah.